All right, everyone dripping in. Welcome to today's webinar. Which are going to be about the mechanics of slow playing. Let's just go to the first slide so you guys can have a little moment to think about this. Share with me your thoughts in the chat. Because you can let your opponent build the pot for you. That's a very good one. So that also automatically means that if your opponent is not going to bet, we should most likely not slow play. There's truth and like some practicality that can go to both sides. If we have an aggressive opponent who's often going to build the pot for us, we are more inclined to slow play. If we have a passive opponent who's less willing to build a pot, we should usually fast play. It's a good point. We slow play because the EV of check and bet are the same. And that usually happens when we block value bets, check backs. Okay, that's a good one. Talking about blocking the calling range and blocking check backs. That's indeed one of the points. So we have two good points already on why we slow play. Blockers indeed will play a big part. There's still one very important point. This is actually the first point I'm going to start with within 1 minute. So if people want to give it a guess. When we think our opponent will bluff or bet worse for value. So a very big important point. This is also something that Matthias touched on, that now Jacob's also touching on. He needs to bet worse for value. Especially when we're out of position, we always have to take in consideration against which hands do we lose value with a check. And these are indeed hands that would likely call a bet, but not that are going to bet themselves. This is also, spoiler alert, where blockers come in. So if we block those hands, we're more likely to slow play. If villain has the range advantage and wants to bet a lot, we need to protect our range. True, this is like, okay, we don't really split our range. Let's say, for example, in position has the range advantage on a board, on the flop, we don't donk. Okay, because if we would start splitting our range, we would get quite fucked. Also, obviously, you don't really want to invest a big pot in a spot where you're far behind. I will go to the first point, to let the opponent realize their equity. That's actually also a good one. Not my first point, but to let your opponent realize their equity when we want to. So this has something to do with the amount of equity the folding range has versus the hand we slow play. So why and when do we slow play? To keep the handcuffs on our opponent, aka to balance and discourage. If we construct a checking range that consists no strong hands, what is the consequence of that strategy for the other player? So let's say we're in the small blind. That's the example that I'm going to give. We bet our strong hands and check our weak hands. What happens to the strategy of imposition, and why is that so bad for us as the small blind? He bets a lot. He can barrel off knowing we're weak. He can bet us out of the pot. The name of the game of poker, guys, what we're trying to do with every strategy, the most important thing is that we're trying to realize as much equity as possible and trying to deny equity realization of our opponent. This is the main objective in every strategy. And what happens if we are unbalanced, we encourage and uncuff the limitations that the GTO model puts upon our opponent to fuck us over. When your checking range only contains weak hands, villain has license to bet a lot and big, which costs us our realization, which we definitely don't want. I'll give you guys an example. We have a queen 10-8 flop, and this is the small blind c-bet strategy in GTO, and this is the big blind stepping strategy in GTO. It mainly prefers a big bet check approach. Big bet in this case, pot is 60, so this is a 3/4 bet, the preferred bet sizing, and checks. Also, you can see that the imposition is going to check back quite a lot of hands, like 10-8, queen 8. There's quite a lot of traps in both players' ranges, okay? And this is, again, to cuff your opponent. If imposition would always check bet strong and check back weak, we would simply overfold versus the betting range and attack in the delayed line. Whereas if the small blind only bets strong and checks weak, then the big blind would just fold versus the betting range and attack the checking range, okay? This is actually a bigger concept that you should always strive towards looking for in game in scenarios where this is the case. So if we, for example, bet our strong hands, so in this case is the GTO, it's quite balanced, it's sometimes checking straights, two pairs, etc. If we say, okay, we don't slow play with two pairs, straights, sets, etc., this is what happens to the betting range of the imposition. It went from a 72% check to a 40% check. And also, I now implemented, I added bigger sizing. So this was a 3/4. This is a slight overbet, 125. And this is a very big overbet, 175. And you can see, because we are no longer checking strong hands to him, he can lower his value bet threshold. That's one, because he's betting any queen, and he can increase our sizing. And therefore, us as out of position, we can no longer realize our equity. Okay. In all situations, we construct our range with traps, especially when out of position, to make sure our strategy and a lot of our hands get to realize equity. Okay. You can also immediately now see that in position, this doesn't apply, because checking if we're in position means 100% realization, because we're going to see the turn. Okay. So let me see. He can bet us out of the pot. And if you bet, you can just fold or overfold. Exactly. We have created an opportunity for our opponent to exploit us. So this is the main reason why we add checks into our game. And this is the consequence. So I'm sure now some people are watching this like, this betting range looks close to what my pool is doing. So then these would be the strategical consequence this will have for you as the big blind. The second point, because we, hero, block villain's calling range, the hands that could call a bet but check behind, those especially. So the more we block the calling range, that means the more he's going to fold if we bet, and the more he's going to bet if we check. Okay, because he will have more bluffs if we block the calling range. The most important hand, okay, for example, if the flop is queen 10-8, if we check, which are hands that are going to check behind, that could call a bet, that's mainly going to be an 8 and a 10. So slow playing will be mainly constructed around having a 10 and an 8. So 10-8, 8s, or 10s. When we have close to 100% equity versus the folding range to make villain catch up. This was actually already a point that someone mentioned, to let opponent realize their equity. If we have pocket 8s or pocket 10s, okay, and let's say versus bet he folds his underpairs, then checking to keep his underpairs in can sometimes result into a very high implied odds situation. Whereas if we have 10-8, okay, 10-8 sometimes, if it lets underpairs in, can make him draw to a very reverse implied odds situation for us. So we be more inclined to slow play a hand that has 100% equity versus the folding range, in this case 8s and 10s, compared to a hand that doesn't have 100% equity versus the folding range, saying 10 and 8. Same with, for example, a hand like pocket kings. Pocket kings is a very strong hand, but the folding range, let's say he folds some ace x to a bet, has some equity versus kings. Whereas if we have 10-8 and he has ace 5, he's drawing sort of dead. Okay. Another reason where we see a lot of slow playing, this is actually something we will not focus on today, but if the SPR is small and we don't need to bet raise this street in order to get the money in. Okay. This is something in 4-bet pots. 3-bet pots, we will usually see a bit more slow playing, or if you're an MTT player and you're playing at a lower SPR, 20 BB pot or 20 BB stacks in a single raise pot, we will see more slow playing than if we're playing 100 BB deep. Also, slow playing at deeper SPRs mainly happens when we're out of position, as in position can still bet and build a pot. This is actually something that Tombo said, because you let your opponent build the pot for you. So if we're out of position, especially if your opponent is aggressive, the main reason why we, for example, overbet on certain boards is because we want to build a pot. If your opponent is very aggressive and you're in a small blind and you check towards the big blind, he's going to do the betting for you. Most of your overbets are actually turning into check raises, okay? Because we're trying to build a pot. When we slow play in position, it's only at low SPRs or if we have top set. And still, this rarely happens, okay? If we still check back an absolute strong hand in situations without the characteristics that I just described, we are actually not slow playing, but pot controlling. The relative, the hand is actually not that strong. This usually happens with 2 pairs on very connected boards. I will give you guys an example of that in a second. So slow playing is mainly being out of position because we can check, he can bet, and then we can still check raise. So why and when do we then fast play? Basically, we can reverse the concepts. We fast play with hands that unblock villain's calling range, and when villain's folding range has more equity versus our hand. So kings, we would much rather fast play than 8-10 because villain's folding range has more equity versus our hand. Jack-9, we would rather fast play than 10-8 because it unblocks the 8x, 10x, and queen x in villain's range. Because there are hands to get value from right now that might not call later and or to deny playability. This was actually for the people who saw my last webinar in 3-bet pots. We talked about adding upsizes to your games in, for example, a board like ace-10-8 two-tone. And that was because we wanted to deny playability. We could bet big and then jam turn and make him fold out his draws and make him call with an ace. Now, if we remove all the ace-x from villain's range, and we're only betting to make him fold a draw, but his calling range only consists of better hands, we no longer wanted to do that. I think I'm going to repeat this for the third time in my webinar. But in order to bet for denial, villain has to keep on calling with enough worse, preferably low equity holdings. Okay. To guarantee a pot gets built, we are in position or play out of position versus a passive opponent. That's when we fast play. Okay. So these are kind of the heuristics. And let's now go to GTO Wizard. I prepared some examples and see how these heuristics lead to slow playing post flop. Okay. Remember, guys, it's a solver. It will do a little bit of everything. Nothing that I say is gonna 100% be 100% check, 0% bet. Okay. It's a general concept that we will see coming back across all the boards. So let's go to the first example. That is this example. My chat disappeared. Is everything clear, by the way? I should have probably asked that before I closed the PowerPoint. But I think so far it makes sense. And we're going to now see these concepts in practice. And I will ask you guys some questions. Starting off with the first example. I think the main examples that I'm going to use are going to be blind versus blind, as this is the most common scenario where you play at a high SPR out of position in a single raise pot. We look at a 9-8-3 flop. I already separated the strong hands in our range. Actually, second pairs are in there, so let's remove them. And we want to look at a trend. Now, the first trend we see with what is a strong hand that we most likely betting, that is pocket tens. Pocket tens is an overpair. Aces is also an overpair. Why do we mostly check aces and mostly bet tens? I think this is a concept that most people understand. That's because of the equity versus the folding range. The folding range that villain, well, the range that villain is folding will contain more equity versus tens. So let's say he folds a hand like king jack. That has a lot of equity versus tens, but not a lot of equity versus aces. So therefore, aces prefers slow playing. Tens prefers fast playing. This is the perfect example of equity versus the folding range. Then if we look to very strong hands, okay, like top pairs, we are betting more the ace because obviously that's an absolute stronger hand. Like tens and aces are the same in sort of hand strength, right? They're overpairs and villain doesn't have other overpairs. But top pairs, obviously, we will bet less top pairs with less kickers because it's simply less of a strong hand. Okay. Then if we go to actually then the concept of 9-8, sometimes betting a little bit more than maybe some with a higher kicker is also to deny equity. Then the other fast play hands that I want to look at is 3s, 8s, and 9s. Why do we bet more often and more frequently big with 3s than we would do with pocket 8s? And why do we bet more often with 9s than with 8s? That's a question that I have for you guys. Because of 7-7-6-6. Okay, what are you referring to with pocket 3s? So if we overbet, you mean? Let's say we make the overbet. Unblock top pairs. This is one. Remember, we fast play when we block villain's continue range, and we slow play when we block villain's continue range, and we fast play when we unblock villain's continue range. If we have pocket 3s, he's way more likely to have an 8 or a 9 in his range than if we have 8s or 9s. So usually, a heuristic that you can use in most situations, the bottom set is always the set that's being played most aggressively. Okay. Good point from Kalsis. So that's one of the points. And the other one was equity the folding range has. So indeed, Kalsis says pocket 3s wants to play aggressive and usually overbet, because if we overbet, we can get other pairs in villain's range to fold. These hands have some equity versus our hand. Actually, pocket 7s has quite a lot of equity, I would say, versus pocket 3s, as they can also turn a lot of straight draws. But if we overbet, all these hands is gone. We can do that. We can focus on denying equity of pocket 7s because villain has a lot of 8x and 9x in his range that are very low equity hands that are going to call our bet. Okay. Now, obviously, if we have pocket 8s, we don't mind villain from realizing. But then why do we bet pocket 9s more often than pocket 8s? 3-3 unblocks it, yes. 8-8 blocks the check back range, which makes it more likely that villain bets. That was indeed the point. If we look at the majority of villain's betting range, is going to be a 9. A 9 is going to bet more often than an 8. Okay. So if we have pocket 8s and our idea is to check raise, or if we have a set and our idea is to check raise, we would much rather check 8s because the amount villain is going to bet if we have pocket eights is greater than if we have pocket nines. If we have pocket nines, we're incentivized to bet more, okay? Because he has more 8x that we can call with. Now, usually we prefer betting the top set for a smaller sizing. That's indeed to keep some of these lower pairs in. And because we block, if we start to go build a very big pot with pocket nines, we're trying to build a pot versus a 9. Usually in the betting line, that's not really the way it's achieved. So these are some examples of flop slow plays. So now let's move to the turn. Let's say we bet 1/3, filling calls. Turn is a 4. We will see similar heuristics come back. Mainly pocket aces. Again, mainly checking for the same reasons as we saw on the flop. Pocket nines continues to bet and pocket eights continues to bet for the same reason we already mentioned on the flop. Pocket threes prefers to bet big most of all the sets for the same reason. Top pairs, okay, top pairs are mainly constructed around their absolute hand strengths, okay? 8-9, why is 8-9 basically in there? A little bit of everything. I can see I can see benefits and downsides with 8-9. What are the, always when we are considering an option, we have to consider the upsides and downsides of both options. So 8-9, you can clearly see the solver. Yeah, he's not really sure. He's not really sure because there's benefits and downsides to both plays, right? Again, if we bet, we can get some of these under pairs out, which could be good. But then again, we have an 8 and a 9. We block all the hands that villain is supposed to call us with, right? Maybe if you have 8-9, you'll be more like, okay, I check and let him bluff his gut shots, his straight draws, etc. But that's mainly what pocket eights and I guess sometimes pocket nines is reserved for. And we induce bluffs with just hands that cannot really value bet. Like the nature of these hands is that value betting has become less attractive. Therefore, bluff catching becomes more attractive. Okay, especially I would say with some of the lower ones like the 9-5, I'm blocking all of the bluffs. All right. Some heuristics for turn barreling, by the way. I think people were asking for that the other time as well when we're playing 3-bet pots. Usually on a board like this, the most likely barrels, if you have, like, let's say, like King Queen, King Jack, King 10, are going to be hands that block the calling range. So that's a heart and that unblock the folding range, which would be a diamond. So I would say a heart and a diamond is going to be the most bet combo. Could also be wrong here. So let's see. But that's usually the way it goes. Okay. A heart and a diamond. Let me see. A heart and a diamond is indeed bet at the fullest frequency there. Whereas the other one, a heart and a diamond, a heart and a diamond. I'm having trouble seeing it. Same with King 10, I guess. Heart and a diamond. Because it unblocks the floats in like King 6 of spades, King 6 of clubs, and it blocks the calls. Okay, that's kind of what you construct your bluffs around. But we mainly wanted to focus on slow plays. So preferred bet on the turn, I would personally have. There's a couple of ways that you could play this on the turn. Like you can see that multiple sizes is being used. I would not recommend trying to implement this in game, especially the GTO Wizard sims. They will have multiple sizings, obviously, because they're running it for all boards possible. So you want to include all sizings. This is not the strategy that you should actually play. Probably I would split here between a small bet, I think half pot and 150%. That's probably what I would arrive with in game, because there's a couple of hands that clearly want to bet big, tens, and there's a couple of hands that clearly want to bet small, Jack 9. Because Jack 9, if Jack 9 starts to check, his main bluffs are going to be around the Jack. So Jack 10, Jack Queen, Jack 7. So I'm not really a big fan of moving these hands into the check call line. I'm more fan of trying to find a sizing for which I can still value bet. So that then leads me to think, okay, I want to have a small betting range because I want to bet a hand like 10-9 or Jack 9. So that would then lead me to have a betting range that's somewhere between block and half pot. But I also have some very strong hands in my range that prefer to overbet. Now nines then kind of protects the other 9x, okay? Because, like I said, we're blocking a lot of Pin 9x, and if we block, we keep a lot of the worst hands in. Okay. When studying spots like this, where everything is indifferent, do you use node locks to help determine your strategy or just RNG? I usually use heuristics that I'm now explaining. Like I'm not for example, I don't see this as RNGs, right? I see tens to kings is betting pure and aces is pure checking. I'm not going to try to RNG out a couple of percent here. I'm just always going to check eights. I'm always going to bet threes, and I'm always going to block pocket nines. Okay. I'm always, like, sometimes here, I will, like I said, I will use the heuristics heart diamond. That's what I will always bet. I will always bet Jack 10, for example. Okay. Personally, like I said, but this can be your preference. This is how I do it. I know some people like to RNG to the number. That's not really my style. Obviously, if I have a read, or if I like a read on my opponent or a read on the population, which is something that you should strive for, because if you try to build, if you get reads on your population, things are no longer indifferent because you have a clear action. And then all the hands that become frequency, because you have studied your population, have a clear action profile. So always want to bet. So for example, the 10-9 and Jack-9, like I said, are not really hands that I would like to have in my checking range. I would prefer to always check 9-7, 9-6, 9-5, for example. So that's kind of how I would then construct my range. I would always check aces. It's kind of how I do it. But you could RNG as well. But I personally try to look for some concepts that I can apply. So I wanted to mainly look at the ace-9, because and let's go in this case for on the 25. Filling calls. And now we're going to see a 5. And I want to focus on these hands. No, with 10-9, no. So in this case, 10-9, you say with 10-9, we need more protection on the turn. But a lot of his, if you bet half pot to 1/3, his calling range is going to contain a lot of Jack 10, Queen 10. So you actually prefer to have 10-9 in your betting range than 7-9 in this case, I would say. But obviously, yeah, you could make arguments for both. I mean, 9-7, that depends. If you check and he starts bluffing with King 10, I mean, I'm not checking 9-7 to fold. So then I don't really mind that realization. No. We bet at the flop 1/3. So we now bet a turn and we see similar heuristics come back. Okay. I want to also include this one. So pocket threes is the set that gets, again, played most aggressively because we will have a big overbet sizing. You see, that's because it's blocking a lot of the 9x and the 8x. Eights, okay, we can see here actually it's checking. That's because it's blocking the hero call range of imposition. And if eights is checking, that means that 9x is betting. Okay, else or at least a significant amount of 9x are going to be betting. So if you think your opponent is going to check behind the 9, okay, then obviously we should be betting pocket eights. All right. Then pocket eights kind of becomes what pocket threes now is. Nines, we can see we actually use a smaller sizing. And that's because we block the calling range in the bigger sizing. All right. So it's a similar heuristic than we saw before. 8-9 now no longer has to be concerned of being outdrawn of these underpairs. And it can now use its blocking properties to focus on trying to get value out of the bluffs, which are going to be 10-7, Jack 7, Queen 10, Jack 10 type of holdings. And because it's blocking the calling range with 8-9, it focuses on bluffing. Okay. Is this clear? Can we see similar concepts, trends in bet sizing? Which hands we slow play, which hands we bet big, which hands we bet small on both flop, turn, and river. I will give another example because I can understand that this might be a little bit much to take in. The heuristic you're mentioning here seems to be for this flop. How to generalize? No. It's not for this flop. This is a generalization. Okay. I can move on to the next flop, and then we can see that I didn't just pick one flop where this is the case. This is a returning pattern. Why do we check 8-8 again and bet 9-9? Yeah, actually, good point. That's what I want to show. I'm imagining that 9x is going to bet, because if 9x would always check behind, we would never check 8s. We check. Yeah, so it's betting most of his 9x. So we're not losing value. This is very, very important. If your opponent checks back Queen 9 after calling overbet on the turn, then we should always bet pocket 8s. Okay. Exactly. So checking loses value versus checking for the check back range. If we block the check back range, which is in this case is an 8, right? An 8 always check back. So if we have 9s, we don't want to check. Okay, we don't want to check 9s because he's going to check back an 8. We want to check 8s because he's not going to check back a 9. Does that make sense? And obviously, you know, this is a board. There's still quite a lot of draws that have missed. So checking and inducing bluffs, there is a purpose for it. However, as you can clearly see, 10s, for example, 10s is blocking the bluffs, right? Jack 10, 10, 7. These are his main bluffs. So it's way more likely that we get value out of the calling range than versus the betting range if we check. Then 9s wants to size down, then 8s wants to check. I think 3s, 8s, 9s, 10s show a very clear concept that you will see coming back. All right. Let's move on to the next example. Where is it? So similar spot. Queen 10 7 small versus big blind is a board that we can just range bet for small. I don't think actually in the GTO Wizard Sims it does that, but it has a higher betting frequency than certain other boards. In general, I would say the Wizard Sims, they are a bit more careful. They do a bit more checking. This is also because it has multiple sizings. Everyone has a lot of sizings. But we see bet at 1/3 and the turn is a 5. And I wanted to focus again on set, 2 pair, over pair, top pair. Surprise, surprise. The lowest set is being played most aggressive in terms of frequency, but mainly in terms of bet sizing. It wants to bet 275% pot. Wait, am I in the correct one? I wasn't in the correct one. Again. No, I was in the correct one. Wait, I'm a bit confused. 1 second. Clear all. Was I in the correct one? Queen 10 7 5. Confirm. Sorry about that. No, we were actually in the, no, we were not in the correct one. We were in the correct one. Okay, I'm confused now. Okay, so we want to build a very big pot. That is because the board is very dry. Okay, Villain has a lot of queen X in his range, but we have the equity advantage. If you look at the ranges, and we are the small blind, best hands. Let's go a bit more advanced. Nuts. We have a clear advantage in the nuts, so we're trying to build a pot. We don't have to be concerned that our nuts is no longer the nuts on the river because the board is very dry, and therefore we start to build quite a big pot. Again, we will see the same trend. 7s being played most aggressive. 10s is being played most passive, because remember, the main hand we lose value from if we check is a 10x. If we have 2 10s, there is no longer, the downside is no longer there. And top pair kind of, if you want to have a small betting range, is going to be usually in there to protect the small betting range. Because if we have 2 queens, he's very likely to have a 10 and a 7. If you only have big bet check, it will usually go to the checking range. Okay. But there, like the strategy here, the small betting strategy is mainly made around pocket jacks, ace 10, king 10 that clearly benefit from small betting. But, you know, you can easily remove the sizing and only bet an overbet sizing, for example. Then I would probably not lean towards 275% pot, even though actually, because the board is so dry, it does make some sense. We can actually get quite a lot of draws to fold. So I don't hate it. I would personally have sticked with 200%. But hey, 275, why not? Then if we look at 2 pairs, so probably something with the 10, right? So 10-7 is the best example of a hand that I would always check. Because we lose value from a 10 and a 7, and we have a 10 and a 7, right? Queen 7 is also checking. That's quite interesting. And he's doing that mainly because it's blocking the call range, right? With the queen. But it's not blocking the check back range. So that's quite interesting. Same with Queen 5. So I'm very curious now how these hands will play in check-check. I would say, is it fair to say that middle sets tend to be the best slow play and bottom sets to play most aggressive? Yes. So it's always bottom set most aggressive, middle set most slow play, top set usually in the small bet if you have one, either or else in the check. And this also kind of depends on the amount of pairs that villain has and obviously how aggressive villain is. But so this is interesting. If it now goes check, check, you can see that Queen 7 and 10-7 and Queen 5. So why is Queen 5 sometimes overbetting and Queen 7 pure checking? I think there's a clear concept here. and 10-7 always betting small. Let's focus on these three hands. Let's say in our world, okay, that's less frequency driven. We try to bet around or place our hands in part of a range based around heuristics. Why would we always bet this hand 1/3, this hand always overbet, and this hand check? There's a good concept here in these three hands, in my opinion. We bet flop, so villain has a lot more 7x than 5x. Yes. So queen 5 is trying to get value out of a 7, right? Because again, a hand that would always check behind, I don't think he's going to value bet a 7, right? No, the value bet threshold seems to be at a 10. So he's going to check behind a 7, but he would probably sometimes hero call a 7. What is the overbet? 135%. He would indeed sometimes hero call a 7. So if we have queen 5 and we check, we lose value versus a 7. Well, if we lose value versus a 7, if that is our main concern, then queen 7 now becomes the check, right? Then you could say, don't we lose value from a 10? Well, it's a bet check line, and we check river again, so all 10x are going to bet. Nah, most 10x, okay? So the value that we lose from a 10 is not that much. A very important point, actually, I didn't touch on both turn and river, so maybe we can go back to turn, but it's also about check raising, okay? We can get way more money in the pot if we check. He bets 60%, I would say is most common. Now we can throw out a big raise, even to an all-in sizing with queen 7 and queen 5. Okay, so we can get way more in the money by checking the river than by betting the river. And it's actually the same on the turn. Sorry for the confusion. We're going to go back to the turn a little bit. Let's say we check. He bets 75%. The main hand that we're going to be check raising is our set. And that's simply because it's just such a strong hand. It wants to build a pot. Queen 7, we can see is sometimes slow playing. And I guess that's because it's blocking more of the call range. And then you could say, why is queen slow playing and not slow playing? Because it just has more equity. It's a stronger hand. Like obviously with queen 7, there's maybe still a river 10 that we kind of have to be worried about. I would say that plays a part. But for example, 10-7 actually is check calling. That's quite interesting. Probably also has something to do with counterfeiting rivers. Yes, we can now try to get value from a queen, but he sometimes has a better hand. There are some bad rivers that can come. So another reason, like I said, why we check is to build a bigger pot than if we would bet overbet ourselves. But I think this concept is mainly true for the river. Okay. We also want to have a small bet, right? Because we went bet check. There's a lot of hands like 10x that prefer to have a small betting range or on the smaller side. Then a good hand to go in there is 10-7 because we are unblocking a queen. And if we block, I would say all queen X. Yeah, all queen X are raising. So then if villain raises 80% pot and we have 10-7, we can come over the top because he has a lot of queen X in this range. Okay. And obviously also in practice, if we block with 10-7, actually not only practice, also in theory, we can induce some bluff raises that usually in practice doesn't really happen if we start overbetting. Okay. So can we see the same heuristics coming back? Pocket 7s, again, a good example, always checks. And 10-7 sometimes bet small because I guess if we have 10-7, you have more 7x that we will lose value from. And if we have 7s, you have no 7x that we lose value from. So does that again make sense? One important one here we didn't touch on is pocket queens. I was saying that, so how 7s, 10s, and queens make money here is very different. 7s can go for the check raise because in position has all 10x and queen X, and we unblock and we block the 7x is going to check behind. If we have queens, he just has 10s and 7s, 10x and a 7 and so often that there's nothing else for us to do than overbet and try to focus on getting value out of these hands. Okay, obviously we would like to try to get the money in, but if we go for the check raise, we're mainly targeting a queen and we have 2 queens. So I hope that makes sense. The benefits and downsides of checking. Is that clear? Then we move on to a next example. I'm trying to get a couple of examples in. How about Jack-Jack? Jack-Jack is overbetting because it's basically a very strong hand. Maybe there's some merging going on. Nah, he's never folding a queen. Because on the turn, if we check, he's going to bet most queen X, I would say. So queen 8. Yeah, he doesn't check back that many queen X. So basically on the river, jacks is just a value bet for this sizing. Yeah, I was going to say he's never folding a queen. So yeah, it's just a value bet. Because that's the size that it can get most value. Now, if you say, yeah, okay, my population would fold most 10x, then obviously you're surpassing the point if you're going to overbet jacks for value, right? How many queen X he value bets on the river when we get called on the turn? All, what do you mean when you get, turn is check, check in this example. But let's say, for example, we would have bet the turn. I mean, if we bet 275%, yeah, it's going to be quite interesting. I don't think he's going to be betting a lot of queen X on the river, I assume. I guess maybe still. I don't know. You see that pocket tens actually is still on the slow play. Yeah, so then it must bet some pocket queens because else pocket tens is not, some queen X. Yeah, it's still betting queen 8 some of the time. I would not try this in game, guys. I think if you bet 275% pot and your villain is there with queen 8, he's just going to knock the table and check behind. Yeah, so on the river, in the check line, we saw that if we have jacks, we are unblocking most of the 10x. Because if we have a 10x, we saw actually that we would sometimes play a smaller bet, 60%. And actually, apparently, we're getting called by ace highs because ace X is going to check. This probably has also something to do with if we have ace 10, he's going to have more king 9 that he will bluff with on the river. So there's a bit more value in inducing bluffs with ace 10. You have more bluffs. And I guess sometimes we get called by ace high, like ace jack or something, if we bet 60%. Okay, sometimes calls ace 9 high. So that's kind of because of those blocker properties. He wants to always check ace 10 because we induce probably versus like king 9, like I said. Yeah, king 9, he's not bluffing ace 9. And he's sometimes here we're calling ace high. So that's the main difference between king 10 and ace 10. Next example, jack 8-6. We see the similar trend. Aces mainly slow playing, queens mainly fast playing. Bottom set here, actually, they're being played quite similar. You can see on this board, there is less of a clear pattern present. The top pairs, we're still just betting based on absolute hand strength. I would personally simplify this to just betting 1/3 with this, checking this, and betting aggressive with this. That's how I would play it. I would not mess around with I would not mess around with too much RNGing here. Same with the 8-6. I would personally always check. Bet, and it calls. Turn is a 5. Let's look at our strong hands. It's actually sometimes checking a straight. That's actually something that I would not recommend because a lot of his villain's bluffing range is going to contain a 9. A lot of villain's checkback range is going to contain a 5, 8, 6, or jack. So I would say 7, 9 just wants to always go for value. Okay, so in practice, if I have a straight here, I will never slow play. Okay, we can again see top set being bet half pot some of the time or check. This one sometimes starts to overbet. And again, bottom set, pocket 5 is played most aggressively, then 6s, then 8s, then jacks. So that heuristic still counts. 6-8, again, something with an 8 that's going to block the calling range, I think is a good check. 8-5 then bets more than 8-6. This is probably because we can get some value out of a 6. But like I said, this is very hard to do in game. So I would usually just stick with the 8-6 heuristic. Jack 6. Again, I think here it's mainly also because if we have, for example, Jack 6, particularly, and he has an 8. He's probably going to bet some of the time, maybe on the turn. So that's 1. He's going to bet some of the time. Do we check raise? Let me see. Jack 6. No, it clearly just wants to call. Maybe actually it wants to dunk bet some rivers. There's some connectivity, so then maybe sometimes we wait for clean rivers. Okay, very sometimes, TheWakko. Very sometimes he's throwing out a 10%. You can see that sometimes when the board becomes more connected, that we do a bit more slow playing, and then we usually follow it up with a river donk bet. But in this case, it's not very frequent. Okay. Let's see, by the way, what happens if we go for the, which bet shall we go for? 125%. No, 75%. Call. Let's say the river is a king. It's quite interesting. Okay, we bet mainly. That's not going to be then too interesting. But the main hand, again, that we're checking is pocket eights for all the same reasons. That means that he's betting a jack on the river most of the time. Jack 10. He's still betting a decent amount of jack X. But it's mainly that that's the main hand we lose value from on the river. Okay. I think that it's clear. I wanted to move to in position. Any questions about out of position and the heuristics that you would use? Like, I think here on the turn, there's quite a lot of combinations to choose from. So if you then want to RNG with some 8-6, 8-5, Jack 6, like there's multiple things going on here when connectedness increases in terms of blocking, but also in terms of equity. So maybe if the turn is a deuce. Because also when boards become more connected, we are more incentivized to slow play. But like I said, then it's not really slow play. Then it's more the fact that we are trailing behind in terms of equity. But that's actually the concept that I want to show in position. Any more questions about out of position? Okay, let's move to in position. Slow playing. Okay. Again, equity versus the folding range. We're playing bottom versus big blind. We will see that mainly aces checking, nines betting. Again, top pairs mainly betting based on hand strength. And no slow playing with very strong hands. Okay, because we're playing in position. That means we cannot check raise. Remember, check raising is also a big part of why we check out of position. It's to build a pot. So in position, very little slow playing. Basically, just aces, kings, and like some weaker top pairs. But this is not slow playing. This is mainly pot controlling in this case. All right. I wanted to also look at a turn spot. Flop queen 10-7. We see that 1/3. And this is also a spot where we sometimes slow play. Okay. When a lot of straights come in on the turn, and we can see here that, for example, queen 10, jack 10, queen 10, jack 10, queen 7 full, jack 7 full. Then why are we slow playing? But we're always betting king queen. Why are we slow playing here? We're in position. The SPR is still very deep. Why are we slow playing? King 9? You mean king 9 in villain's range? So basically what you're saying is just equity. Yeah. So indeed, we're slow playing because of the equity. So there's, again, a couple of reasons. All the heuristics of slow playing will come back. If we never check back a strong hand on the turn, out of position has license to be very aggressive and this is very important, to lower his value betting threshold. Blocks hands that you check. Yeah, again, no, I mean, it's blocking hands that we can get value from. That's one. But mainly, if it wants to get value, okay, it has to already size down a little bit, preferred sizing 75%. But again, equity versus the folding range. If we have queen 7 and he has 10-5, which he will have, and will most likely fold most of the time. 10-5. 10-5 is 0% equity versus queen 7. Okay. Could sometimes river a 5, and then we have a good life. A lot of these hands, whereas for example, king queen, okay, which is always betting, 10-5 has more equity versus king queen than it has versus queen 7. Also, king queen, okay, can outdraw a lot of hands. So let's say he has 2 pair, we still have a lot of equity. So basically, if you look at the equities, strategy, I want to see equities. King queen, okay, actually has more equity than queen 7 because of the draw. So in this case, we prefer to bet a relative strong hand than an absolute strong hand. But like I said, I don't really want to label this as slow playing. We're more pot controlling than that we are slow playing, to be honest. Okay. And then we're picking the hands again, the queen seven, that have where the folding range is very little equity, and the continue range has a lot of equity, because the continue range versus a bet, even if you only bet 3/4, will be mainly around, like, for example, because the board is so drawy, it can fold queen five. Okay. So it's becoming first the calling range. We're actually not doing that well with like a hand like 10-7, right? Because we have to dodge an 8, a 9, a jack, a queen, a king, an ace, a spade. Maybe is also not the greatest, depending if we have a spade in our hand. So it's more of a pot control line. And like I said, I think I cut it off my story. If we never check back a strong hand on the turn, what will happen is that villain will become more aggressive. So his bet frequency will go up, his sizing will go up. And this is a very big problem. What then happens is he can lower his value bet threshold. So he can suddenly maybe overbet a hand like queen 9 on the river. And we are still forced to defend enough. And that's the way he will just generate a lot of EV. Okay. Also, because he's going to bet more frequently, we will have less of an opportunity to go for a bet check, bet bluff on the river, for example. So these are some extra things to take in consideration. It blocks the hands that will check you on the river. Yeah, we already discussed that. Another example on the turn where this is the case, king 10, 3, 9. We see again 10, 9. It's blocking the 10 and the 9. That's exactly the hands to get value from. So we're blocking some of the calling range. And again, it's just the amount of equity. We can see that again here with ace king and king queen. This is just a pot control. Exactly. That's what I was saying. It's just pot controlling. We cannot really call this slow playing. Kings, for example, is slow playing. That's a slow play. Okay, it's blocking too much of the calling range. Villain will check on any pair on this flop. So sometimes he will get some Rios or induce a bluff. Most probably some pairs will bluff the river. Let's say the river is a 7. Most probably pocket deuces will bluff. Yeah, pocket deuces starts to bluff, so it can sometimes induce. So kings, like I said in the slides, only top set would sometimes slow play in position. Okay, getting raised is terrible, and you block none of the raising range. Yeah, true. So it's indeed mainly pot controlling the turn. Also, again, to look at the equity the folding range has. King queen has the straight draw to go, so it's a relative stronger hand than ace king. Okay, also versus the one-third bet, is probably beating a lot of ace high with backdoors. So again, if we bet king queen on the turn, it has more equity versus the calling range, and the folding range has more equity versus king queen than if we have ace king. All right. So these are some heuristics around slow playing, if we can call it slow playing in position. But like I said, slow playing is mainly a thing when we play out of position. And that's because when we check, sometimes in position bet, and then we can check raise. So we can still build a pot. In position, we check behind, and then we just realize our equity. All right. So these were the main examples that I prepared for you. I see that we are actually done a little bit earlier than expected. So I hope that all of the heuristics that I showed, when do we slow play? Like I said, I didn't really cover a small SPR, but in 3-bet pots, 4-bet pots, we will definitely implement slow plays. But I hope you guys have some heuristics now around which you can slow play. Also, the considerations: do I need to slow play? Is my opponent going to exploit me when I don't check any strong hands? That's also an interesting question. Is my opponent going to do the betting for me, or am I facing a very passive opponent? Versus that, you might want to lower the amount that you want to check. So maybe only the middle set, right? Because that's kind of the nut example. So another reason also why, but that was more of a river thing. But the main reasons why we're slow playing flop and turn are going to be these. Okay, these would always come back. The first 3 points. Did we have a 5th point? No, the first 3 points. That's where you want to build your slow player heuristics around. Any questions? No, Mr. Rekko, everything clear. That's good. Some main takeaways maybe for some people that are like, oh, wow, I was never doing this or I was never doing that in some of the examples that I gave. Or it maybe became clearer when to do it, when not to do it, and maybe you were misapplying some things. Yes, it was blind versus blind. The queen 10, 7, 5 deuce. Excellent presentation. Thanks. No problem. Yeah, I did slow play too many top sets because I unblocked bluffs. But yeah, especially the one on the bet check bet on the river, I think is very counterintuitive, right? That we were mainly overbetting the top set because you think like, I'm only getting an overbet in. I would much rather check raise, but you're losing a lot of value versus the 10x and the 7x in that case. And obviously, if you have sevens, that doesn't really count. So sevens, therefore, was the best check raise candidate. I thought that was pretty cool. Learned a lot. Great presentation. Okay, guys. My pleasure. Hope to see you guys in the next webinar. Drop your suggestions, what you mainly want to see. Someone suggested also some small blind, big blind stuff. So that's also actually another reason why I focused a little bit more on walking through the 3 small blind versus big blind. So we kind of cover both topics. Thank you. All right. Thank you, guys. See you.